Okay, so you all are here today to learn a little bit about bobcats and about, whoops, let me see if I can fix this, and about coyotes. Let's see. Okay, that worked. Jens, do you want to give a little introduction about Microsoft
Sure.
Teams and?
Yeah. If
Okay.
folks would please make sure that your microphones are muted, and you're welcome to have your video on, but please know that we're recording this session, and we'll be communicating with you through the chat. So please feel free to write questions in the chat while Bree or myself are speaking. We'll take about 3 breaks over the course of the webinar, and we'll be addressing questions directly from the chat. Because there's so many people with us, we won't be able to take live questions today. So please do direct your questions to the chat. For right now, feel free to introduce yourselves on the chat with your name and what town or organization you're with, just to help us get a sense of who all is here. But with that, back over to you, Bree.
All right, as I mentioned before, we're going to be talking about bobcat, coyotes, and how they share habitat, and then Jens is going to talk a little bit about land use planning. So to jump right into it, because there's a lot of information to share. All right, let's start off with bobcat. So I'm going to share a little bit about what I know about bobcat here in Vermont and generally about their behavior and ecology. So they generally are widespread across the U.S. They're limited by snow depth that's usually about 5 feet or greater. So once you start getting into those northern zones up past Canada, you'll start to see their distribution die off a little bit. So here in Vermont, they're very common. And we have it at here in Vermont, we have it at very northernmost edge of its range. And yeah, it's very widely distributed across the United States. Many people know bobcats as being very effective predators. Their minimum prey requirements for just surviving depends on the time of year. So during the winter time, they're focused more on trying to find primarily like things that's going to give them more energy and things that are going to allow them to survive the winter. So they might focus a little bit more on deer or whatever resources that they can find. But either way, they are very effective predators and they focus on what they can find throughout the year to keep them alive. A little bit about their life history. So generally, males are larger than females. The adults usually weigh about 10 to 30 pounds. This is actually larger than lynx. For just a fun fact, a lot of folks feel that lynx are larger than bobcat, but actually the bobcat weighs heavier, and it's about twice the size of a domestic cat. Large bobcats that are within the 50-pound range have been rarely reported in Vermont. I mean, we do get them. More recently, we've been getting quite a few. So it seems as though they're doing well. They generally breed in late winter and give birth in the springtime. Their reproductive tract examinations have shown that they have about 50%. That 50% of the yearling females breed, and the average litter size is about 1 kitten. Nearly 75% of adults breed with litter sizes that range from 1 to 6 kittens and an average of 2 kittens. And similar to many species, food availability influences reproductive success. So like many carnivores, the male bobcats tend to have larger home ranges than females, typically 2 to 3 times larger. Their home ranges vary widely, but research has shown that female bobcats range from approximately 10 to 15 square miles and males from 10 to 80 square miles. So to give that kind of more of a relative framework, that's smaller than Burlington, but not too much smaller than Burlington. But it can vary a lot. Their home range size is influenced by their sex, their age, the habitat that they use, the prey availability, and the population size in general. Adult females typically occupy home ranges that do not overlap with those of other adult females, and male home ranges may overlap with one another and also with females. Typically, range sizes shrink when the prey density increases and there's less of a need to travel as far for food. This behavior is similar to many species, especially carnivores. Generally, bobcats are solitary. They're not incredibly social. And they use a form of territoriality to partition their available habitat. So, again, the adult females don't typically overlap, and male home ranges can overlap with other males. When they do overlap, they tend to avoid contact with each other by temporal spacing. And bobcats, the males mark their territories by scent marking, which is spraying urine on standing rocks or trees. So very similar to a house cat. We've learned a lot about bobcat habitat use in Vermont over the last decade or so. So in 2017, there was research that was conducted in the Champlain Valley that told us a lot about how they're using the landscape. So the areas in green in this map will show you the areas that have the best habitat use for bobcat. So you can see the Champlain Valley definitely sticks out as an area that is very conducive to bobcats. So even though that bobcats are adaptable, and they're able to tolerate some human alterations to the landscape, they prefer shrub and forest habitats and wetlands and rocky edges. They can tolerate some habitat fragmentation if there are connecting corridors, which is important. It's really important for all species to have connecting corridors. The number of bobcats in an area will depend on the availability of these habitat types. So they'll often use hedgerows and riparian corridors to move across the landscape and actually move faster when these habitats go through low quality areas such as developments or open land, assumingly to avoid them. So in other words, roads and open fields and developments are not good for bobcats. They can travel fairly fast in areas where there's corridors, especially in these fragmented landscapes. The males will travel farther and faster than females do. And typically, bobcats are moving the most during the evening hours. So this picture here shows a collared bobcat that was part of the 2017 study in the Champlain Valley. The purple dots represent locations that one bobcat was located or documented to be in, and you can see that they avoid those open areas and they're using those corridors or those forested areas to move around. So those large agricultural fields are not being used. The study also found that the travel speed increased when the forested strip was surrounded by non-forested habitat. So linear forest features such as hedgerows were not preferred habitat, but so they're moving through it, but speed will decrease when the used forested strip was surrounded by a significant amount of additional forest in the available buffer. So they prefer to use forested habitats for travel, but this preference is highly influenced by landscape scale forest cover. During the wintertime, especially if you're trying to find a bobcat, you may look adjacent to some of these agricultural areas and look at a nice dense forested area and another dense forested area across the road, and you might be lucky enough to see some bobcat tracks passing through. Some habitat recommendations that we just learned about. So we want to maintain large buffers along riparian corridors and wetlands. We want to maintain those undeveloped blocks of habitat that are composed of scrub and shrub, hardwood and softwood forests, wetlands and streams. We want to protect rock ledge areas that are important for them for breeding habitat. And we want to minimize the road fragmentation. With that, I'll take some questions.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Bree. So
Yeah.
we don't have any questions ready to go, so I'd love to take this moment to remind folks that at any point during the presentation, you can feel free to jot your questions or comments as they come to you right in the chat. And there's a lot of us today, so I'll keep track of those questions and we'll try to answer as many as we can during the breaks. So feel free to think if you have any questions, start to put those down in the chat. But Bree, for now, let's jump right into section 2, and then we can circle back to questions at our next break.
All right, sounds good. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the eastern coyote, one of my favorite species for sure, and I can talk probably for hours and hours about coyotes, but I'll again give a broad overview about some of their behavior and their ecology, starting off with their history. So the history of coyotes in the Northeast is really interesting. They weren't originally always here. So they had expanded from their Western territories in the early 1900s, and they took two different routes. One was underneath the Great Lakes and one was over the Great Lakes. And so during that time, they actually interbred with several other species, including domestic dogs. So when they did the interbreeding, it turned out that the coyotes that we have here today do still show up with those mixed genetics of having some various wolf genetics from different populations, coyote genetics from out west, and then also domestic dog. So it's really interesting because not all coyotes have the same exact perfect DNA. There's a lot of variability based on location and historically kind of how these genes have played out on the landscape. They came to Vermont very fast, which is unlike a lot of different species that usually take advantage of a new area. They're highly adaptable and they can move at incredible speeds. So here's some maps, historical maps that show how fast that they inhabited Vermont. It happens in about 20 to 25 years, which is incredible. The first known coyote appeared in Vermont in 1948, so you can kind of see the distribution over those 20 years expand. And so it happened at a rapid rate. And it's really interesting, especially in the context of thinking about how habitat and how wildlife diversity exists today and what it was like, not too long ago. And we have this relatively new predator on the landscape. Their diet is similar to bobcats in that they are usually taking advantage of the high energy available foods that they have, and it's very seasonal as well. So during the winter time, they're actually consuming more meat, and then during the summertime and spring, they'll transition to being a little bit more opportunistic. So they'll eat more berries and nuts. In the wintertime, they also scavenge. So they do kind of do some diet switching and they can take advantage of a variety of different resources and are not as specialized on finding prey as maybe the bobcat is. Their breeding season lasts from late January until February, so it's coming up here soon. Pups are usually born about 60 days later, usually in late March or early April. There's some variation with this depending on where they are. So at lower latitudes in the United States, they will breed actually a little bit later. Oh, I'm sorry, earlier. So pairs, they might stay together for the duration of their entire existence. So they typically are monogamous, and both parents care for the pups. The young disperse in the fall, and how many pups are in the litter are hardly dependent on how much prey that they can find in an area. And this is a trait that pretty much all canids have. And typically the younger pairs, so juveniles that are breeding for the very first time, have lower reproductive success than adults or pairs that have been together for a long time, because they're just learning and they don't know how to take care of themselves quite yet. So it's their reproductive success goes down, but as they get older, they learn a little bit more and they become more successful. They mark their territories in a variety of different ways. So in April through May, there might be more coyote encounters or more people seeing coyotes. And that's because the males are marking their territory for where they can find food resources for their young. So think of it as a way to protect valuable resources, like fencing in an area, for example. Scent marking in those key areas or on the boundary of those areas signals to other coyotes that this is their spot and don't encroach on my area because this food is ours and we need it to raise our young. Territory marking serves as other purposes too. It signals to females of their reproductive status. It allows them to communicate with neighboring packs and establishing boundaries and keeping subdominant males in check. It has a lot of variation depending on the area and how much prey is available. If the pickings are good, they may not mind some competition. And the same is true for the entire pack size as well. A lot of times they'll tolerate subdominant males in the area or even throughout the winter in their pack, or I guess in their social unit, if the food availability is good. But if it's scarce and they're having trouble finding food, then they won't tolerate each other very well. So they scent mark their territories to defend their core home ranges from other unrelated coyotes. And the howls that you commonly hear at night are sometimes a way to warn other coyotes that the territory is already occupied. So the fact that they aggressively defend their home range helps to limit the size of the population here in Vermont. So the primary social unit is a family group, as I've already mentioned. So this consists of the mated pair and the offspring under 1 year of age. These social units may include late dispersing juveniles and non-related individuals, or even extended family members, and they might cooperate in a pack. And all of this, again, is dependent on prey availability. They usually hold discrete territories with very limited overlap in home ranges. And outside of the family group, there will be transient individuals that normally range anywhere from like 6 to 18 months of age. And then they can reside within other territories as long as they're tolerated. Commonly get asked whether or not coyotes travel in packs. And, they do have these family groups, and sometimes they will travel in packs, especially during the wintertime. There are benefits of being in a pack. They have large prey here, like deer, that being in a pack, it's more efficient to catch a deer if you're in a pack versus just being an individual. The carcass can be easily defended as the number of coyotes are cooperatively hunting. So it just helps them defend food resources and get higher calorie meals. It's an advantage, especially when small populations or small mammal populations are low. Wolves will do this as well. And how big a pack can get really depends on how many juveniles will stay with mom and dad and whether or not they're tolerated. Ooh, and with that, I will take some more questions, or a question, or any questions.
Great, thank you, Bree. Okay, so yeah, we have some questions all about the biology of coyotes and a couple for bobcats. So maybe I'll pull in some coyote questions since we're on that topic, and then we can jump back to bobcats. Great. Okay, so you were just talking. This may be a quick one. You were just talking about pack size. Yeah, that's right. Some folks mentioning in the comments, or group size, or family group size. And it sounds like it can be very variable, but is there an average number, or is it just too variable to kind of put a number on the average size of coyote groups?
I would say that it's incredibly variable. I mean, you could have as many as 10 individuals in a family group, really, but probably not more than that in an area. And the larger it gets, kind of the looser it gets as well. But really, it's incredibly variable. And again, just on how much prey is in the area and whether or not they will actually tolerate each other.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Now, what about age in the wild? So how long do coyotes live in the wild, And then we can shift into bobcats. How long do bobcats tend to live in the wild as well?
So coyotes both will not live past, 12 years or so. Typically, coyotes, they've got a little bit of a rough life. Like even though they're so successful and they're so adaptable to so many different environments, they are getting beat up by not only their prey because they're chasing deer, for example, and a deer will kick them and, there goes a couple teeth. But they also, fight with each other. So they might be left with a lot of, inner specific wounds or other injuries that can really limit their ability to survive. So they get beat up a little bit more probably than bobcats do. And so I would say, yeah, for both species, probably no more than 12. And I'd have to check our records to see what the oldest bobcat that we have is, but I know some bobcats have come in as being fairly large, and in the 50-pound range. And that's pretty incredible. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're old. It just means that they're really fat and healthy.
Okay, another question about bobcats. What time of day are they most active?
They are mostly active in dawn and dusk and during the middle of the night. So that doesn't mean that you won't see them during the day. You could totally see them during the day, and that's not abnormal. But they're moving around the most at night, because that's when they're going to be least detected. They're crepuscular and nocturnal.
And is the same true for coyotes?
Yeah, generally. Yep. Yeah, they
Great.
both try to avoid humans as much as possible as well.
Okay, great. We got some good questions in here. So let's take, I think we can do one or two more, and then we'll jump to the next section, and we'll keep circling back. Okay, so one from our previous section, we're talking about bobcats, and someone asked, how much development is really too much development for a bobcat? If they're tolerant of a certain amount of development, is there a limit, where bobcats are just, not going to be around on the landscape?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. There has been research in other states in the Northeast, I believe in Connecticut, that have demonstrated that bobcats will actually be pretty adaptable to developed areas. And so people are seeing bobcats in their backyards in like suburbia. And that was happening more often than people realized. And so I think it has more to do with the actual fragmentation of the habitat, and whether or not there's um, enough for them to move through these spaces undetected. So it's not, I don't know a figure off the top of my head in terms of like how much development will actually negatively impact them, but generally you're going to see development um, impact them in a negative way. But as long as there's those corridors, that's what matters.
Thanks, Bree. Okay, so let's do one more question, and then it'll be a perfect time to move on. So one of our guests wrote that they often see coyotes leaving scat in the middle of a trail, but
Yeah.
other times they see scat left on rocks or just off the trail. So are those two observations related to a specific message that's being sent? If so, is it the same message depending on the placement on the trail or off the trail?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, wolves do this as well. So it's another way of marking their territory. It's similar to what I was already talking about earlier, and scent marking, but generally, they're leaving scat in areas that are going to be very conspicuous and and letting other species as well as other coyotes know, like, hey, this is my area, and you better back off, because I've got good food here. So yeah, they tend to defecate in very conspicuous areas, and it's kind of like showing off.
Great. Okay, so we still have some more good questions, but let's jump into the next section and then we'll circle back at our next break.
Awesome. Okay, so oops, hold on. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about how they social, if they have any social distancing. So the two species are obviously carnivores, and they overlap in habitat. And again, coyotes are relatively new on the landscape. Oh, can
I'll
everyone
keep going,
see?
Bree.
Oh, okay.
There was just an extra mic on.
So one of the interesting questions that we have is, how do they influence each other and how do they compete for resources? So the competition between carnivores is fairly complex, and it really can affect the distribution and abundance of either species. Again, those home ranges are really dependent on how much food availability that there actually is. The bobcats, they might outcompete coyotes for hair density in certain areas. So for example, in the Northeast Kingdom, they may be more abundant than coyotes are. And they're primarily hunting the snowshoe hare in those areas. So for like one prey resource, the snowshoe hare, they may be more effective at catching than, say, a coyote is. So here's just a little graph that shows the history of what happened when coyotes came to Vermont. So with that competition, you can kind of see, like in the 1960s to 70s, when the coyotes first came here, we had like an all-time population boom of coyotes, or sorry, of bobcat. And then once the coyotes came in, they tended to drop in numbers. So their population, it was estimated that it decreased, but there's a lot of good information that we've been collecting to suggest that both populations have pretty much evened out at what they can tolerate on the landscape. And a lot of it also has to do with the shifts in prey abundance in the habitat. Again, the corridors and the amount of connected habitat we have and the amount of prey resources that they're going to have is really going to influence how they affect each other. But they can exist in the same habitats for a variety of different reasons. So they either hunt in the same habitats or hunt in different habitats, but their habitat use patterns will differ quite a bit. So as before, I mentioned that the coyote is a little bit more omnivore or omnivorous. So it takes advantage of a variety of resources throughout the year. So they kind of prey switch depending on the time of year, whereas bobcats are generally focusing more on those small mammals. So they are primarily focused on that. And if our small mammal population were to decline, we would probably see an impact on bobcat numbers. But yeah, generally limitations to the bobcats are more habitat related than is the presence of coyotes. And specifically, those limitations are going to be related to less mature forest cover and deeper snow conditions. And we're still learning quite a bit. We have a number of cameras out there for the last decade, gosh, probably more than that at this point. And we're looking at several different factors as it relates to their habitat use for both species. We look at how much that they overlap. In that map that you're seeing there, that's just kind of an example of what camera data can show us is the frequency at which different species are detected and how much that they overlap in a certain area. That can tell us a lot of information and could lead to us taking proactive conservation measurements or proactive conservation measures. But it can also lead to further research that would wind up being really important. But generally, the ongoing camera research is going to provide more information about their habitat use and their density as well. So for both species, they're widely distributed across the state, and there isn't any areas, again, for both species that they don't exist in Vermont. And kind of related to the question that we were answering earlier about bobcat habitat and whether or not they can tolerate disturbance and fragmentation, they can, and they can adapt fairly well to it. Again, it's about that the corridors, whereas coyotes, on the other hand, they can live, gosh, if a bomb were to drop today, they would still go on living because they're so highly adaptable and they don't need those corridors nearly as much as bobcats do. Even though they've both really done well with human development, I would say that the coyote is definitely the winner in terms of being able to adapt and modify their behavior and their diet relatively fast and just accept human development in general. So yeah, that's pretty much how they coexist with some differences in how they share habitat.
So Bree, I
And
noticed that you had that great shot of a trail camera. And one of our questions, somebody had a great observation. They said they observed a coyote chewing on their trail camera at one point. And have you ever seen a behavior like that? And do you have any sense as to what that might signify in terms of behavior?
huh. I would suspect that it has something to do with the scent that's left behind on the trail camera. So if you were using some sort of scent lure or something like that, a coyote might come in and investigate and may nibble on it. Probably it was not trying to eat the camera. It's probably just trying to figure out where that scent is coming from. But I don't think that that's a very common thing. Bears, on the other hand, are a completely different story. Bears will probably take a nibble of your camera and then probably eat the whole thing.
Wow, I have not observed that. That's amazing. Okay, great. A couple more questions. So since coyotes form mating pairs that are monogamous, you mentioned, if either the male or the female in the pair dies, will the other coyote maintain that territory and sort of maintain fidelity to the territory that they defended as a pair?
From what I understand, yes. But again, it kind of depends on the social status. I mean, if it's a young coyote that loses their mate, then I think that they probably wouldn't have the best luck at maintaining that territory, whereas like older, more experienced pairs, a female might be more prone to like defend an area where because she knows that area, she knows it well, or he knows whoever's left behind, I guess. And so I think that there's a lot of variation in there. And yeah, and it just again it depends on how much the prey base shifts in relation to that as well.
So this part two of that question is then how do coyotes go about gaining another mate? Would there be some kind of courtship to form a new mate partnership, or what do we know?
Scent marking, and they're letting each other know of their reproductive status. So if there's a single if there's a single coyote out there, it's letting other coyotes know from scent marking. So they generally will couple up in around this time of year, actually, and before they start breeding in January. And during that time, during the courtship, they're also letting each other know like whether or not um, they're worth it, whether or not their reproductive fitness is going to be a good match for them.
So Jennifer notes that the photos have been fantastic. I absolutely agree. Some beautiful photos. Jennifer called out specifically the coyotes are just really beautiful in these photos. And Jennifer's wondering how much color variation is there amongst coyotes? Because there are a couple different color shading patterns that appeared in those photos.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a great question. So there's a lot of variation in coyote fur. And some areas in Vermont have a more distinct coloration than other areas. So like for example, excuse me, in the Randolph area, I believe it is, kind of more in the middle of the state, there's more red hues to their fur, whereas in other areas, like there might be more black hues. It just really depends. And again, it has a lot to do with that mixed genetics, and it could be all over the place. So the red ones are the ones that are like really beautiful.
Great. Okay, so we have a couple of questions here. I see one question about fishers. So I'm gonna hold that one till we probably our last Q&A, see if we have some time to fit that one in. Here's a question about coyotes and human interactions. Do coyotes predate on human food waste like bears do?
It depends on what you mean by waste, but they can and they will, and oftentimes coyotes are drawn to areas where there's going to be things that they can eat. So if mice are or smaller mammals are attracted to your garden, for example, that might draw in some coyotes. If there's some compost that's left or garbage that's kind of laying around that again attracts those smaller mammals like raccoons or opossums or something, then yeah, then they're gonna hone in on that because they are very effective and they know where to find their food. So yeah, I mean they'll definitely take advantage of human waste, just like bears would.
Okay, great. Still some more questions coming in. Thank you so much, folks. These are great questions. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So we had one question that I paused on that because it's going to be a good segue to our last section. So we'll jump into our last section here where Jens is going to take over. But that question was, what should a conservation commission know about managing to support these animals? So let's pause on that question. Let's jump into our final section where we'll actually have a little bit of covering some aspects of that question, and then we'll circle back for Q&A at the very end.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Bree, and thanks, Dave. So let's get into this last section. I just wanted to pick up where Bree had been talking a bit about some of the telemetry data, the GPS collar data that we have for bobcats, and think a little bit more about the interaction on the landscape and then that municipal planning piece that's near and dear to my heart when Dave and I working with the Community Wildlife Program. So what you see on screen are several cats around in Shelburne, and I just want to zoom in on this one in particular around Shelburne Pond. And so here is that same telemetry data, and you can see that this cat spent a lot of time in the wetland itself, where there's some tall grasses, places to hide, and good hunting, and then used this shrub line to connect the good quality habitat of the area around Shelburne Pond and that forested area over in St. George and sort of the foothills of the Green Mountains. So Bree had talked about the speed increasing as they're moving along corridors like this, but that they're still, so it's not exactly suitable habitat, but they're certainly using them to connect the habitat. And so I want to think a little bit more about this interaction of roads and wildlife. So, at left, you see the Vermont conservation design, and I'll pick up on this in the next slide. But it really shows this network of connected forests and waters across Vermont. And so you can think of this, parts of this network as the highway of wildlife movement, right? So I put these purple arrows on top of the conservation design to show that, the spine of the greens, there's the relatively few road crossings that connect, that bisect the whole spine of the green. And so it's pretty easy to move up along the spine of the green. And yet the network of connected habitat across the state is much, much more complicated than that. Unlike out west, where they have huge herds of ungulates crossing the same road segment at the same time, what we have in Vermont is more of the solitary moose. This is on Route 100 at Shutesville Hill. And so we have the one animal at a time crossing, that solitary animal, and that's much more typical. And there are hundreds hundreds and hundreds of crossings throughout the state. So the network that you see at left is really simplified and just showing these major connection points, whereas the true network of wildlife movement across Vermont involves many, many more wildlife crossings. So I had talked about that map coming from the conservation design, and Dave and I have done many webinars on that, and I know many of you have attended, but I just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page. The conservation design is a science-based vision to sustain the state's valued natural areas, forests, waters, wildlife, and plants for future generations. So it's this prioritization of the forests and waters that are most important to maintain for connected habitat. So in this design, we can begin to understand what places are most important for maintaining species like bobcat and coyote, and where those are across the landscape, and how the priority of those differ from other places on the landscape. So we really want to talk about this at a variety of different scales. So Vermont is at the crossroads of connected habitat across the entire northern Appalachians ecoregion. And what you see on screen is a map of the northern Appalachians, and the blobs of color are the Staying Connected initiative's ecoregionally significant linkage areas. So these are not just the core forests, these are the places in between core forests where we're interested in maintaining connected habitat. And so we want to maintain this connected pattern across the entire northern Appalachian ecoregion so that wildlife can adjust their ranges in the face of a changing climate. The Nature Conservancy is estimating that wildlife are moving, entire populations are moving on average about 11 miles per decade, north and south away from the equator. It's about a mile per year. And so we're seeing continental scale movement of climate. Well, within Vermont, the network of connected forests and waters is incredibly important. And we have this pattern that you can see in the conservation design that connects from north to south and east to west. It connects from high elevation to low elevation. It involves wildlife road crossings and the entire surface water network. And so thinking at that scale is also important. What is that larger landscape pattern? And that's a message I share with towns quite a bit, is thinking about the pattern on the landscape. And then, of course, these individual wildlife road crossings. None of those other scales matter unless you have many of these individual wildlife road crossings. And so all of these different scales are important to consider when thinking about the needs of species like bobcat and coyote and how to maintain them and what we can do. So I just mentioned pattern, and let's take a look at that in a different way. So this is an aerial photo from Rutland County, and you can see that there are these large core forests. And so as we think about what we can do at the town level with municipal land use planning, well, begin by thinking about, well, where are the core forest blocks, the largest forest blocks? And we know that compared to smaller blocks, there's more biological diversity in larger blocks in your town than there are in smaller blocks. So larger blocks, more biological diversity. Okay, so that's a starting place for thinking about town planning, is we're going to have more species in these larger blocks. We're going to have more room to roam for animals like bobcat and coyote. And so we know those core forests are incredibly important. Then we also want to consider what I'll call stepping stone forests. These are smaller forest blocks, but their position on the landscape is incredibly important because it's a stepping stone between the larger core forests. So here we can see that you can't get from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen without using that stepping stone. And so some forest blocks, even though they're smaller, are going to be incredibly important in town planning because of their context, because of their position. And then, of course, there are these micro connectors, these wildlife road crossings, places where there's wetland or evergreen habitat on both sides of the road. They connect larger forests. Oftentimes, there's bridges or culverts there to allow for a stream to go under the road and potentially to allow for wildlife to go under the road. And then, of course, there's also the entire aquatic network, the streamside connectors, riparian habitats, streamside vegetation. And so in many parts of Vermont, particularly the Champlain Valley and the Connecticut River Valley, this aquatic network really helps knit together the forest blocks. And so bobcat and coyote will move along the streams and the rivers to connect to larger forest blocks. So that's the pattern that we're looking for at the town level to maintain, is this connected pattern. Now, the problem is that sprawl development is really the default sort of development style here in Vermont. What I'm talking about is auto-dependent strip development. It's outside of compact urban and village centers. Here is on screen is a picture of Burlington to South Burlington, but perhaps this is a more common type of development that we see in Vermont. The sprawling ex-urban sprawl, the rural sprawl. And so sprawl development really threatens that pattern, that connected pattern that I'm talking about. And so sprawl development, we really need to get a handle on that and encourage clustering development in our village centers so that we can have, be surrounded by farms and forests and not just surrounded by residential forests. So here are a few good examples at the municipal level. The Newfane Town Plan has really excellent wildlife resources and natural features section. They have policies talking about obtaining more information and looking at developmental land use regulations. They begin with this idea of this larger pattern of their forests and how that's fragmented by sprawl. And they really want to talk about forests in all of the context. So talking about the contribution to forests make to our economy and our culture. So the town plan can be a great place for making the case for this sort of pattern of large forests, not just for wildlife, but also for economy and community values, and this need for connectivity. And so you could also include in the transportation section, you can also include information about the importance of bridges and culverts for wildlife movement and the need to appropriately size our infrastructure to allow for floodwaters, movement of debris, again, with an eye towards climate change, and also for movement of wildlife. And so the town plan is a great starting place for that kind of work. Then you can also think about regulatory tools. Here are the land use districts for the town of Waitsfield. They have a large forest reserve district. And you can see that it really helps with that north-south movement along the Northfield Range. And so, thinking about the zoning districts and what those look like can be an important next step, again, towards minimizing the pattern. Enforcing that pattern. My one critique of the Waitsfield zoning districts that you see in front of you is that they are very isolated. They're very zonal, and it doesn't increase connectivity in terms of it allows for development really parallel to in between the Northfield Range and the Mad River. And so we get that it allows for some of that sprawl that we're trying to limit. Now, that's not the extent of Waitsfield's regulations, but I did just want to point out that pattern that it's increasing. So let's take a look at Bolton, and their 2005 zoning did much the same thing. The green is the forest district, the yellow is the conservation district, and that stippled light brown, you might call it, is their rural residential district. And that really, for my mind, that's really, that is zoned for sprawl. And in this case, it's east-west sprawl, parallel to I-89 and the Winooski River. And that's a bad pattern for wildlife. And Bolton, as you may know, is really incredibly important for north-south movement. along the spine of the Greens or the foothills of the Greens. So when Bolton reworked its zoning in 2001, it redrew those district boundaries and really brought the forest and conservation districts down to the highway. And those locations actually overlap with transportation infrastructure that goes under I-89. So in this case, their district boundaries themselves really called on that landscape pattern that we're looking for that allows for wildlife movement. And of course, these districts line up with permanently conserved land in Duxbury on the other side of the river. Another example is Jericho, and they did an overlay district. So this is on top of their regular zoning. And at the heart of their overlay district, it includes wildlife road crossings, riparian areas, and a variety of other important features. And so they hold those areas to a higher regulatory standard, and as a way of limiting development in certain parts of town more so than in others. So there are a variety of tools municipalities can use to really address this sort of landscape pattern that we're looking for to maintain species like bobcat and coyote on the landscape. Now, here are a couple of resources. The BioFinder website is the best place to see Vermont conservation design. Mapping Vermont's Natural Heritage is a guide to how to use BioFinder and the conservation design for municipal land use planning. And Community Strategies for Vermont's Forests and Wildlife is a book by the Vermont Natural Resources Council that focuses on municipal tools like zoning districts, overlay districts, subdivision, and can help you learn a lot more about what municipal tools are at play. So I hope that was helpful in terms of bringing all the great information that Bree shared about the biology and the ecology of these habitat, of these species, and really bringing it into that world of municipal land use planning. So thank you so much. We do have a few more minutes. So Dave, back over to you.
Great. Okay, so Jens just gave us all a lot to think about in terms of what we can know about managing for coyotes and bobcats to help them on the landscape, especially in terms of thinking about these wildlife road crossings and riparian corridors. But I want to kind of throw that question back to Jens and Bree in case you have more to say about that, kind of as parting words. And that question was, what should a conservation commission know, or really any other organization know, if they're trying to manage to support bobcats and coyotes? Any other sort of parting words or wisdom on that question?
I would just say that the size of our forest really does matter. And as we get towards completely isolated forest blocks that are completely surrounded by roads and development, we are not going to enjoy the same number or diversity of species that we currently enjoy. And so that pattern really does matter, and towns get to choose what their pattern looks like. And so essentially, towns get to choose. Do you want to maintain bear on the landscape? Do you want to maintain bobcat on the landscape? Or are you looking for a landscape of squirrels, raccoons, and skunks? And you really, we really do get to choose that through our land use.
Yeah, that was really well said, Jens. Yeah, I would say that the fragmented landscape aspect affects like all species, and it's probably one of the largest threats to all different species that we have here in Vermont, and throughout the Northeast in general. But I would say too, it was a question that was posed earlier about human waste. I think that that's something that could be really important, as well as, we want people to have a respectful distance and be able to observe wildlife at a respectful distance. We don't necessarily want people to have these negative encounters with bobcats or coyote. So those frequency of interactions tend to increase when people are attracting them to their area. And so when that happens, you have, more opportunity for negative consequences there. So we want to encourage, either, people to have waste cleanup or to secure their gardens or other means to protect wildlife in an area, because public perception goes a long way in terms of the protection and conservation of these species, and we really don't want to see folks think that, you know, these species don't deserve attention and that they're pests, because they're not. And we do have ways to live with them. We just need to make sure that we're cleaning up after ourselves, and we're protecting our livestock, and we're protecting our gardens.
Thank you both for that. Okay, so we just have 2 minutes here. I know I apologize to everyone in advance. I won't be able to fit in all the questions, but I'll try to sneak in a couple of short ones. So one quick one for Bree was, are there diseases that bobcats and coyotes face frequently in the wild?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, it's probably one of the leading causes of density dependent, like, population declines. And it would be for both species, they could both get rabies. In bobcats, it's really rare. In coyotes, it's also fairly rare. They're more prone to distemper, which has similar characteristics or similar signs and symptoms. But rabies would probably be the largest threat to them, as well as distemper here in the Northeast. But there's a variety of different research that has been going on about different zoonotic diseases, about whether or not they're exposed to COVID. There is active research into bobcat gamma herpes, which is a herpes virus that we don't know how it impacts them. As far as we know, it hasn't shown to have an impact on them. But there's a variety of different things that can impact them on the disease level. And another thing too is avian influenza. Avian influenza, we had a bobcat that tested positive last year. So we don't know the extent at which avian influenza is impacting bobcats. We don't think that it's very many, because we're not seeing bobcats drop like flies all over the landscape. And if that were the case, then obviously that would ring the bell of alarm, and we would take prompt action. So yeah, I would say that the biggest things are probably going to be rabies and distemper for both species.
Thanks, Bree. All right, folks, so we're going to call it there on time. I know we couldn't get to all these questions, but what I'd like you to do is just note on the screen here, Brianne and Jens's contact information. We love to answer questions, and we always try to be as helpful as we can. So if you have a question that wasn't answered, I know there was a question about fishers. There's a question about from Greensboro about wildlife tracking. So please reach out to Jens or Brianne, and we'd love to answer all those questions. So thank you again for coming today. This was a great presentation. Thank you, Jens, and thank you, Bree, and great questions from all of you. So thank you for participating, and have a great day.
Take care, everyone. Thank you, Bree. Great work.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. Feel
Thank
free to
you.
contact me anytime.